Good evening. It is a blessing to be out tonight, and we're hitting that time of year where even as early as it is, it's obviously tonight. We're going to spend most of our time tonight in Genesis, but we're going to start in Galatians. I want to tie in what we're going to talk about in Genesis to where we're going in Galatians over the course of the next few weeks. We talked this morning about these Galatian churches abandoning the gospel in exchange for a different gospel. And we noted that one of the things that's going on there is that they're abandoning this good news about Jesus of Nazareth for a different set of good news. But we didn't develop what that other sort of good news, so-called, was. Paul's going to do that over the course of the letter. I want us to jump ahead a bit. I'm going to start in Galatians chapter 3 and read verse 18. One of the distinctions that Paul is going to draw is between the true good news, which in this section of Galatians he's going to be referring to as the promise, because he's tying this back to Abraham. He's drawing a contrast between that, on the one hand, and the law, on the other hand, because that's what these Galatian churches have been turning towards. This is the supposed good news that is better than the true good news, at least in their eyes. And what Paul says in Galatians 3:18 is, if the inheritance comes by the law, it no longer comes by promise, but God gave it, that is the inheritance, to Abraham by a promise. What Paul's doing here is he's tapping into some Old Testament language that starts all the way back in Genesis and that God uses all through the Old Testament in referring to His plan for... you can call it different things. You could call it His plan for salvation. You could call His plan for dealing with the sin problem. You could call it His plan for bringing everything back to Himself. But this is the plan that God starts back in Genesis. You'll remember how the first few chapters of Genesis goes. It's basically downhill. Starts out great, and then it's all downhill from there. And by the time we reach Genesis 12, not only has man sinned and been forced out of the garden, there's been the first murder. Things have gotten so bad that God has reached out and hit the reset button. And what we have recorded immediately after that, after God says, all right, things are so bad, we just need to start over. I'm going to preserve Noah and his family, and we're going to make a new start with them. Things are not promising right out of the gate. Noah's first inclination after hitting dry land is to grow some grapes and get drunk. And as mankind begins to flourish over the earth again, mankind's first inclination is to build a tower for himself, to try to glorify his own name. And so as we're reading along, if we're confronted with Genesis for the first time, we're wondering, all right, how on earth is this story going to go anywhere good? It seems like things are they go from bad to worse, and anytime God tries to clean up the mess is there again. Until we hit chapter 12. I'm going to read a set of 3 verses from the story of Abram. Just individual verses, and those are going to be our text for tonight. We'll start in Genesis 12, verse 10. Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. That's our first text. Our second text, Genesis 13 and verse 10. And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. At this point, if the Bible had a soundtrack, it would play, dum, dum, dum. That's our second text. Then Genesis 16, verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And we know where that story goes. Right, 3 separate incidents early in the life of Abram. In fact, these all happened before God changes his name to Abraham and Sarai's name to Sarah. And all of these texts have one thing in common. These 3 passages are the only 3 times that the nation of Egypt is mentioned in the life of Abram. These references, they're not coincidental. They have a deeper connection to them. We noted in Galatians that Paul's drawing this contrast between 2 sets of good news, between the promise and the law. And in the Old Testament, a different set of terms is used to draw basically the same contrast. In this part of the Old Testament, Egypt is a stand-in for all sorts of things. Egypt becomes something that God, in talking to his people, constantly refers back to. Right? Egypt is the nation that represents not just physical slavery, but spiritual slavery. Right? Paul picks up on that language as well. Slavery to sin. He uses that in Romans. Egypt represents also for Israel. Right? Remember the story of Israel coming out in the Exodus. As they're wandering in the wilderness, they start complaining. All right? They complain about all sorts of things. Right? We don't have any water. We don't have any food. And what do they start thinking rather wistfully of? Egypt. They start thinking back to all of the wonderful food that they had, all the watermelon that they got to enjoy, all the water that they had camped out in their slave camps next to the Nile. But of course they're conveniently forgetting the hundreds of years of slavery that they endured. Because whenever you're really hungry for watermelon, it'll make you forget about things like that. And as we're reading Genesis, remember, Genesis' original audience would have been Israel. Right? Moses wrote Genesis. And if you're an Israelite reading through the story of Abram, and you have just come out of Egypt, these references to Egypt should be evocative to you. Because what's going on in each of these 3 instances in the life of Abram and his relatives, Lot in chapter 13, is that God is using Egypt in the same way that he always uses Egypt. He's drawing a contrast between the promise that he is making and an alternative. Just as Paul says, there's a contrast between the promise, the good news of Jesus, and the alternatives. We're going to be doing a bit of jumping around between these 3 chapters tonight, so keep those couple of pages available to you. Let's jump back to Genesis chapter 12. All right, we had read just a moment ago in verse 10 that there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to wait out the famine. All right, let's establish some context. Where is he moving from? Let us go all the way to the beginning of Genesis chapter 12. This is when the Lord first calls Abram. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and to him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Right, so the Lord has just commissioned Abram to go out and journey. He's just given him all of the promises. These promises that basically the rest of Scripture hangs on these promises. The land promise, the nation promise, the seed promise. So Abram went, continuing on, as the Lord told him, and Lot, his nephew, went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they acquired in Haran. And they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on, still going toward the Negeb. All right, so the Lord has shown Abram the land of promise. All right, we don't know how much time has elapsed here. Excuse me. But the Lord, at least as we're reading this text, the Lord very quickly goes from promising, I'll give you a land, go to the land that I will show you. We go very quickly from that to Abram arriving in the land, and the Lord telling him, this land in front of you is the promised land. This is the land that your offspring will inhabit. So it's not just to be Abram's inheritance, but the inheritance for all Israel. But no sooner does Abram show up in Scripture than Egypt also shows up. We've talked about how Egypt symbolizes the alternative to the promise. Abram, of course, stands in for the promises. The father of the faithful, people who adhere to the promise, as we're going to see him presented in Galatians chapter 3, in other texts like Romans 4. Egypt stands in as a nation of oppression and idolatry. When the famine starts in the promised land, Abram's immediate reaction is to go down to Egypt. The promised land seemingly has become barren. In a literal sense, it has become barren. It is stopping, it's not producing food. It is not producing life. Egypt, with its Nile floods and its abundance of grain, it looks like a natural solution for Abram. And so he sets his sight on Egypt, and forsaking this seemingly barren promised land, opts for Egypt instead and travels down to Egypt. We'll see what comes of that in a moment. Let's set up some additional context. Go down to chapter 13. All right, we read just a moment ago in Genesis 13, verse 10, Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. Let's set up some context for this incident, and let's see if the same thing is going on. This almost seems like an insignificant reference to Egypt. In fact, they're not actually in Egypt whenever Moses makes this reference to Egypt. He merely notes that Lot thinks that this land that he's about to choose looks like the land of Egypt, particularly in how abundant it seems. But let's read the verses around that. Let's go back and we'll start in, We'll pick up at the beginning of chapter 13. So these first two instances kind of run into each other. Verse 1, so Abram went up from Egypt after something happened there, we'll get to in a minute. He went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the Negeb. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold. And he journeyed on from the Negeb as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning between Bethel and Ai. All right, so we just read about this place earlier in chapter 12. This is where the Lord had appeared to Abram and showed him the land and said, this is going to be the land of the inheritance. And this is where Abram had set up an altar, as it continues in verse 4, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. And Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. Then Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I'll go to the right. Or if you take the right hand, then I'll go to the left." All right, and it's at this point that Lot lifts up his eyes and saw the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. All right, this is where some cultural knowledge comes in handy. Because, at least in the way that we tell directions, if we were telling this story today, or you could even imagine yourself having this discussion with Abram. Let's say that you're trying to separate out some land, and somebody tells you, you can either have the land to the left or the land to the right. What would you normally think are left and right? But typically, like if you had to guess, typically we would think of them as west and east, right? The way that we orient ourselves, you look at a map and up is north, right? I tell you what, eventually I'll get used to that. So you look at the map and up is north because we're a north-oriented culture. Right? We understand that the magnetic poles are at the north and the south of the earth. And so that's the way we've oriented our thinking about directions. Plus, we've got we orient ourselves by the stars, and that's how we can tell north. We've always been looking north, and everything else is in reference to the north. So left and right to us are west and east. That was not the case in ancient Near Eastern culture. To them, the primary direction was east. So whenever they oriented themselves, they were looking east. As far as I know, they didn't draw maps. But if they had, they would have put east at the top. And so whenever Abram is talking about the left hand and the right hand, he's looking out to the east, and he's asking Lot to decide between the north and the south. So you either settle your flocks in the north and I'll send mine south, or you settle yours in the south and I'll send mine north. And what does Lot choose? Neither of the above. He chooses east. The options that he has in front of him don't look as good as this other option that he's discovered. The Jordan Valley that is in front of him, neither to the left hand or the right hand. And again, we're faced with a similar situation. Abram and Lot, it seems, are not going to be supported on the land which they inhabit. It seems like the land is not producing enough to keep their herds up. And so Lot chooses the option that looks like Egypt. All right, and we're told about this land in maybe one of the most ominous parenthetical statements in Scripture. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. We know where that story is going. The last text that we read, the one that we read a while ago in Genesis 16, deals with a separate promise. The last two examples in Genesis 12 and Genesis 13 dealt with the land promise. So God promises Abram, this is the land that you're going to inherit, and Abram chooses to go to Egypt instead to seek food. Lot chooses to head east to seek food. In Genesis 16, we read just a moment ago, verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. This pertains to what we call the seed promise. In Genesis 12 and verse 2, God promised to Abram, "I will make of you a great nation." In other words, he is going to have lots of offspring. In fact, God's going to phrase it a little differently later, that Abram's offspring are going to be so numerous that it's going to be like the sand or like the stars. You can't count them. They're going to be so numerous. So God has made that promise. In fact, if I remember right, he had just done that in chapter 15. He promises Abram a child, and Sarah, or his wife Sarai, is going to be the mother of this promised child. But we read in verse 1, Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, because, and let's continue on, Sarah in verse 2, Sarai said to Abram, "Behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children." So she is barren. "Go in to my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram her husband as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarai, Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please. Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. So as we've noted in the last two examples, here it looks like the promise has become barren. The promise is not going to produce fruit. The promise is not going to produce life. In other words, it looks like the promise isn't going to pan out. And Abram, just as he has done previously, seems to choose a better option, this time with the help of his wife Sarai. The promise of God doesn't look like it's going to pan out, so he chooses the Egyptian option, the female Egyptian servant named Hagar. So in all three of these cases, it looks like God's promise is barren, it's not going to pan out, and Abram, Lot, Sarai, they all choose the Egyptian option to try to basically to rephrase it, to reframe it in Paul's language, to find some better good news. Right? The good news of the seed promise doesn't look all that good. The good news of the land promise doesn't look all that good. We're going to find some better news. Well, what happens whenever you choose the Egyptian option? Because remember, Moses is presenting this to us not just to record history for history's sake. The Holy Spirit, I doubt, sat Moses down and said, you're going to make a history special that's worthy of the BBC or the History Channel. That's not the interest in Genesis. He's telling us these stories in this particular order with this particular language for a reason. Because he intends for us to think on Egypt, to think on what these characters are doing and apply them to what we do. And so we likewise, we're confronted with God's promise, and we're also confronted with various Egyptian options. Probably not literally from Egypt, although who knows. But each of us is going to be confronted with good news, that is Jesus of Nazareth, and what might seem like better news. And we have to choose between which is the true good news, which is the promise, which is going to be fruitful. Let's look at the consequences of choosing the Egyptian option. Let's return to Genesis 12. So we're going to finish these three texts, consider what the consequences are, and then wrap up. All right, so in Genesis 12, Abram has been in the promised land. It looks barren, and so he goes to Egypt. Verse 11. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, his wife, I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance. All right, he's not just buttering her up, by the way. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say that you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw the woman was very beautiful. And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake he dealt well with Abram. And he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go. And Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. By the way, before we go on, if you're reading a couple of translations, the King James and the New King James, they have rendered this, in essence, I almost took her for my wife. There's no support for that translation in the Hebrew. The text reads that Pharaoh did indeed take Sarai as his wife, with all that entails. The consequence here is that Abram chose the seemingly more fruitful option, Egypt, and left Egypt a cuckold. So the woman who was to bear the promised child to Abram is now lost her purity because Abram took the option that looked better to him. Let's see what things look like in Genesis 13. What happens when you take the Egyptian option in Genesis 13? We'll pick up in verse 11. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley, and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. Then the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, Lift up your eyes and look to the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever. Actually, I should have skipped that. I'd written the wrong thing down. If we jump ahead to Genesis 14, we see what happens to Lot. All right, so we get a repetition of the promise at the end of Genesis 13. In chapter 14, there's a war going on. In the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim, these kings made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. And all these joined forces in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. 12 years they had served Kedorlaomer, but in the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year, Kedorlaomer and the kings who were with him came and defeated the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karnaim, the Zunim in Ham, the Amim in Shavath Kiriathaim, and the Horites in their hill country of Seir, as far as El Paran on the border of the wilderness. And they turned back and came to En-Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and defeated all the country of the Amalekites and also the Amorites who were dwelling in Hazon Tamar. Then the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out and they joined battle in the valley of Siddim with Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of Goyim, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar. 4 kings against 5. Now the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen pits, and as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell into them, and the rest fled to the hill country. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah, and all their provisions, and went on their way. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and went on their way. Lot thinks that things look pretty good for him, heading out into Sodom and Gomorrah. But right away, things go south. Because he gets caught up in this war between the 9 kings. He gets taken captive. Abram has to go and rescue him. And of course, we know the rest of the story with Lot and his family. And I think we know it well enough, and we're running late enough that I'm not going to recount all the details of that sordid tale. Except to note the bits that we always forget. At the end of all of that, as Sodom has been driven out of the city and has lost his wife, who's become a table spice, he goes and hides in a cave with his daughters. And his daughters hatch this cockamamie scheme that we don't talk about very often because it's not nice to talk about these kinds of things in church. They say, our father, Lot, is left without any sort of inheritance on the earth, meaning he has no sons. They say our family's basically been destroyed. Our father's name is going to cease to exist on the earth. We need to fix this. And like I said, the way in which they choose to fix it, we typically don't talk about in church. So I won't mention it here. But all of that comes from Lot's simple decision to head to a land that looks like Egypt. That's what the Egyptian option gets him. So in Genesis 12, Abram has been cuckolded. In Genesis, later on in Genesis, Lot enters an incestuous relationship. Let's see what happens in Genesis 16. Excuse me. So, Sarai has just chased Hagar out of the camp. All right, things immediately go south in this transaction as well. All right, because Hagar conceives and she begins abusing her mistress. And it makes Sarai angry, and so Sarai sends her out. So we pick up in chapter 16, verse 7. The angel of the Lord found her, that is Hagar, by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? She said, I'm fleeing from my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. What does that sound like, by the way? We've heard those words before. I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. This is basically a parallel to the seed promise that God gave to Abram. He's making the same promise to Sarai because she is bearing, after all, Abram's child. The angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are a God of seeing. For she said, truly, here I have seen him who looks after me. Therefore the well was called Bir-lahai-roi, and it lies between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. And Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. Now there's a lot more that we could read about the history of Ishmael, but the angel of the Lord basically summarizes it in that poetic section in verses 11 and 12. Particularly verse 12, he shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. Particularly, the descendants of the true son of promise, Isaac. And again, it's something we would have to read through lots and lots of the Old Testament to see this struggle play out between the descendants of Ishmael and the descendants of Isaac. But it's something that dominates the conflict of the Old Testament, and is in fact something that still is a source of conflict to this day between the sons of Ishmael and the sons of Isaac. And so that is what results from choosing the Egyptian option in that case. So in every single case, Abram and Lot and Sarai, they are presented with what they ought to take, true good news. And instead, they opt for Egypt, or what looks like Egypt. What looks to be fertile and abundant, what looks like it's going to work out well. And in every single one of these cases, disaster, complete disaster. And that is the message for tonight. You can go ahead and take out your songbooks. I think one of the things that God intends for us to learn from these episodes, from repeating basically the same story 3 times over in close succession in Genesis, is that is what will happen to us. In fact, you can pretty much guarantee if you were listening to these stories as an Israelite, as Moses was telling them, you would have to pick up on that, right? Because you've just been complaining about how much you miss watermelon and how much you want to go back to Egypt. And the lesson is, don't go back to Egypt. However barren the promise of God looks, Egypt is worse. And God's promise will turn out if you give it time. The Egyptian option will never, ever turn out, except for disaster for you and your household. So in daily life, you're going to be confronted with times when the Lord's promise doesn't look like much. And there's an Egyptian option that's staring you in the face and it looks like something great. And so the call tonight is to ignore the Egyptian option, to hold fast to the promise. The song, "There is Power in the Blood," has been selected. If you are in need of being baptized, if you're struggling with a public sin that you need to confess before the congregation, if you've been taking the Egyptian option and you're ready to return to the promise, now is a convenient time to do so, and we invite you to do so as together we stand and sing.